So, I was going to write a different sermon. I had it planned out in my head. It was going to be about the disciples not knowing what to do with all that they had seen, so they go back to the life they had known before, their pre-Jesus life, their fishing life. I thought that the previous chapter of John was vague enough about which disciples had seen the risen Lord. Maybe Peter doesn't even know the resurrection has happened yet. That was my plan. And then, my seminary class, the last one for the whole semester, on Thursday night, we talked about this very chapter. And my seminary professor mentioned that this is the first time in the Gospel of John, just in the Gospel of John, but still in the Gospel of John, this is the first time the disciples fish. Which kind of blew my mind, because I assumed that in every Gospel they fish. I assumed that in every Gospel Jesus shows up and says, hey, you guys, come, follow me. I'll make you fish for people. But that's a different Gospel. That's not the Gospel of John. I mean, they're from Galilee. It's a fishing culture. They probably are fisher people, but that's not in this gospel. I knew that John had been written in the last of all of the Gospels, and I asked if the writer of John knew these Gospels. I figured, well, you have a seminary professor there, you should ask questions as you're sort of scrambling to rethink your sermon for Sunday. And she said, actually, in an interesting, she said 50%, there's like a 50-50 split among scholars. 50% of scholars from about the time John was written onward have thought that John knew about the other Gospels that came before his, and 50% have said, I don't really think so. And in the Gospel of John, we always have this chapter. It's not like the Gospel of Mark, where sometimes we have one ending in a manuscript and another ending we have in another manuscript of Mark. This chapter is always there, and I mention that because it's weird. Because if you read straight through the whole Gospel of John, we've got in chapter 20, Jesus is resurrected. All of the disciples are there. And when John says the disciples, I learned this Thursday night, that usually means all 12 and maybe more. So Peter has seen the risen Lord, and he still decides to go fishing. And it's just a strange sort of ending. I mean, Jesus has given them a mission, and instead of going out and founding the church, like you might expect Peter to do, the next chapter, it's like he's never seen Jesus. He says, I'm going fishing, and Jesus appears on the shore. And again, it's like they've never seen Jesus, which makes me think, maybe in his post-resurrection life, Jesus, how often does Jesus check? Because you notice in post-resurrection stories, people don't always recognize Jesus. And they often recognize Jesus around food. We don't get the Road to Emmaus story this year, but you may remember there's some years we get the Road to Emmaus story. The disciples are going and they walk with Jesus for 6 miles, which takes probably 7 or 8 hours, and they talk. They don't know it's Jesus with them until he breaks the bread. Here too, they don't know it's Jesus, which is fascinating to me. So, back to today's gospel. And I don't have an answer. You're probably waiting for me to tell you this. The answer my seminary professor told me nobody knows why Peter decides to go fishing. And if you're wondering why he's naked and fishing, you may be thinking, well, that must be how they fished back then. No. That's probably a mistranslation. My seminary professor thinks he probably wasn't naked, anyway. But I know you're not here thinking, I didn't really sign up. So let's not focus on the weirdnesses of the passage. The nakedness, the why they don't recognize Jesus, why are they fishing. Let's focus on what feels familiar, because in some ways, this gospel and this passage in this gospel works very nicely as like the closing conclusion to all of the gospels. So it has always come, we know that it was composed last, and we know that it has always in the Bible been placed last. And when the church fathers came together and decided they needed to decide which 4 gospels would be, or which gospels, there were lots of gospels, lots of people had been writing down what they thought they knew about Jesus. And at a point around 200 or so, 200 to 300, the church fathers, the church leadership, I use fathers, gendered specifically, they said, we got to get a hold of this, and we've got to figure out what it is we think we know about Jesus, and we've got to figure out which books are going to be our holy books. And they chose the 4 Gospels, and it may frustrate you that there are so many different pictures of Jesus in these Gospels, but this was intentional. The fact that they don't always agree is a feature. It's done on purpose. It's done so that by reading these 4 Gospels together, we have a more complete vision of who Jesus is. So if you wanted to do a deep dive into this, each Gospel has a really different perspective and a really different focus and comes at Jesus a really different way. And then we get to this ending, which is sort of like I was going to say the greatest hits of what has gone before it. So I'll stick with that metaphor. A conclusion, an overview, a reminder of what we should have learned about Jesus. So there's the fishing. So even though the disciples haven't fished in the rest of John, the writer of the Gospel of John probably thought of them as fishermen, because by that point, it was roughly 80 years after the death of Jesus. So all of this would have been transmitted orally, and then as the first disciples are approaching the age of death, and Jesus hasn't come back, they say, we better write this down. So the idea that these men were fishermen would have been familiar, we think, to the Gospel writer of John. They're fishing on the Sea of Tiberias. And you might say, Tiberias? Here's an interesting fact. The Sea of Tiberias is actually also the Sea of Galilee. The Emperor Tiberius, who is the one who had Jesus crucified, decided to rename the Sea of Galilee after himself. So sometimes you'll see a reference to the Sea of Tiberias, sometimes you'll see a reference to the Sea of Galilee. He also, all of Roman leaders taxed people to as close to the breaking point as was possible. The Emperor Tiberius declared that no one could fish without his permission, so the facts in the Gospel about the big fish that they caught and the number of fish that they caught, people like you and me, we might say, yes, abundance, Jesus, our God of abundance. But it's also Jesus who says, your empire tells you you're not allowed to fish. Your empire tells you you can't catch a big fish under the rule. Under the law, if you caught a big fish, you had to send it to the emperor. You can have the little itty-bitty nothing fish. But the big fish went to him. And Jesus comes along and says, cast down your nets. And they get a lot of big fish, which they really should have reported to the emperor. They're breaking the law by having this breakfast on the beach. Something that you can think about as you think about all of this. Our God is the God of abundance, and our God says to us, you know what? Your empire wants you to behave certain ways about abundance, and I come to give you more than you can possibly use, more than you can eat. They are fishing. They are fishing by the Sea of Tiberias, which is also, if you go back to the 6th chapter of John, the Sea of Tiberias is where Jesus' miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 was also by the Sea of Tiberias. There it wasn't a fishing miracle. The food was already there, and Jesus multiplied it. Early listeners would have heard that. Early listeners would have said Tiberias, earlier miracle, Tiberias, that emperor that taxes us to the nth degree so that we lose our fishing boats, so that we lose our land, so that we are beholden to the emperor. And what does Tiberius do with all of this tax money? What do you think? Does the Emperor Tiberius feed the poor? No. Does the Emperor Tiberius improve the roads for the people to use? No. Makes better palaces for himself. Thus it has been, and perhaps thus it shall always be. But Jesus comes along and says, you don't need to worry about what your worldly rulers aren't providing for you. I have enough food. Here, cast down your nets again. Try again. It is this abundance that enables the disciples to recognize Jesus. They're only 100 yards from the shore, less than 1/10 of a mile. Peter cannot wait. I've always loved Peter's enthusiasm. Peter says, it's Jesus. And instead of saying, okay, let's row faster, no, Peter leaps over the boat, swims ashore to Jesus, and finds out that Jesus has cooked them breakfast. Jesus has cooked them breakfast on a charcoal fire. Again, something that just went right over my head, because I'm like, of course, you got to cook breakfast. You had some charcoal, great. You didn't have to dry out the wood. You brought your own charcoal. It's quicker. No, the charcoal fire is also a reference you may or may not remember a few weeks ago when we last heard about a charcoal fire, where Jesus has been arrested, and there's a charcoal fire out in the outer courtyard. Peter wants to get warm. There are other people who want to get warm. They say, hey, we saw you with that guy, Jesus. Charcoal fire, Peter backs up. I can just imagine Peter going, I don't want to be warmed this bad. And that is the site at which Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Now here's Jesus, cooking on a charcoal fire. Interesting. Jesus gives Peter another chance to declare his allegiance. Jesus gives Peter another chance to answer those questions. Do you know me? Do you love me? Weeks ago, and this, I suppose, in the narrative would have only been days ago, Peter was the one saying, oh, I don't know that guy. I don't know Jesus. Never heard of Jesus. I got a Galilean accent, but I've never heard of Jesus. Here now, Peter finally has a chance to say, I love you. He has a chance to claim Jesus, and he does. And it's a powerful lesson for Peter, and it's a powerful lesson for all of us. Here, as with Thomas last week, Jesus meets a disciple where the disciple is and gives the disciple another chance, right? Jesus does not say, you know what, if you need this much proof, I'm out of here. Jesus does not say, you know, if you're not going to say that you know me in my time of deepest pain and trouble, forget it. No, Jesus shows up and cooks breakfast and has a reunion with Peter and restores Peter's reputation. Another important element, because here's Peter who goes on to be head of the church and has already sort of claimed that mantle or had that mantle put on him, depending on how you want to interpret the actions of Peter. And this chapter helps people understand why Peter can go from the guy who denied Jesus to the one who is one of the pillars of the new church. It's a restoration. And here is Jesus. One last thing to think about. We end with a meal, as we have had so many meals throughout this gospel and all the gospels. Jesus leaves the tomb. He does not go back to the tomb. Jesus is still bearing the physical wounds of betrayal, and he goes and looks for his friends. He wants to share another meal, and that's what he does. And I imagine that's what we would do too, if we could have one more chance to hang out with our loved ones that we have lost. And you might be looking at that last part of the message about being led where we don't want to go. And the resurrection message can be lost in the magic of the chance to have a meal again. Post-resurrection life is not a return to the life we had before. And maybe that is why Jesus, in the Gospel of John, in the resurrection scene with Mary Magdalene, Jesus says, don't touch me. Which is kind of odd, because just verses later, Thomas has a chance to touch him. He doesn't touch him. Maybe Jesus is saying, you know, it's not going to be, I'm back, and I'm glad, but it's not going to be the way that it was before. We have different work that we have to do. But it does have some of the markers of the old life. A meal of fish and bread, a command to care for others, similarly, feed my sheep, an abundance that earthly powers cannot match. It's one of the central mysteries of our faith. Through Jesus, the powers of death are defeated, but for much of our lives, it very much appears that those powers are still in control as we succumb perhaps to doubt, perhaps to denial. But rest assured, by the Sea of Tiberias and throughout human history, the story of Jesus is not one of reversal of power, but of a redefinition of the very nature of power itself. Jesus shows us what is important by the breaking of the bread, the drinking of the wine, and all that those acts mean. From the beginning of his ministry to the last meal on the beach, Jesus commands us to love God and love each other, and Jesus shows us what that love looks like. Jesus shows us a quality of mercy, and he models that mercy for us in this scene today and in countless others. And we can forgive each other the way that Jesus forgives Peter. Jesus shows us how to feed each other, physically through breakfast on the beach, spiritually through forgiveness and restoration. We live in a world where the powers and principalities of the world do not feed us, but instead they try to train us to fight over the scraps left over from imperial rulers who do not have our best interests at heart. Jesus shows us another world is possible, a world of abundance for all, not just the ones at the top. Let us show the same enthusiasm as Peter, diving into the water, an all-in response to our Savior who waits on the beach, cooking us breakfast, offering us forgiveness again and again. Let us cast down our nets one more time. Even those times when we're sure it's a pointless endeavor, let us cast down our nets. Let us recognize the abundance that God offers. Nets full to the point of breaking, but not breaking. Breakfast waiting on the shore. Sustenance for all of us.